In our last video, we explored 10 maps from history that changed the world. One of their last maps was made in the 20th century, and we're going to continue talking about the 20th century, and in particular, 7 maps that only could have been made in the 20th century to highlight cartographic advancements in recent history. This article, 7 Maps That Only Could Have Been Made in the 20th Century, was written by Sarah Laskow and published on May 14, 2015. She writes, "Mapmaking may now be a more popular activity than in any other time in history. Every time a person looks for directions online, a new customized map is born. Just a century or so ago, none of the mapmaking tools we now take for granted even existed, and a new book, The History of Cartography, Volume 6, Cartography in the 20th Century, released this month by University of Chicago Press, traces the incredible advances in the last century that made possible the map-obsessed world of today. In the 20th century, there was an explosion of mapping, says Mark Monmonier, the geology professor who edited this new volume. Cartographers could see the world from above, first from airplanes, then from space, and maps went electric. Old maps were converted into digital form, satellites captured topographical data digitally, and born digital maps became increasingly interactive. The electronic transition definitely the 20th century more than anything else," Monmonier says. The encyclopedic history contains a wealth of rich illustration. We've pulled out 7 maps that only could have been made in the 20th century, and a bonus map from the 21st that shows how far cartography has already progressed in contemporary times. The first map is from 1909. See the image on the top left. This is travel time in days from Berlin at the start of the 20th century. The image is courtesy of the University of Chicago Press. In 1909, traveling far from home still meant traveling over land or getting on a ship. This map shows how long it would take to travel to any place in the world from Berlin. The most remote place in the world from a European perspective was still the center of Africa. Timbuktu, in the continent's west, is just on the edge of what was then accessible. But, as Monmonier points out, the map also shows the impact of the Suez Canal. Quote, "There's that red arm branching out toward the southeast," he points out, an indication that the canal made a whole new part of the world accessible. See the image on the bottom left. This is from 1944. We see Europe from the east. The image is from Richard Harris Eden, courtesy of University of Chicago Press. Richard Eads Harrison made maps for Fortune and Life magazines. He had an atlas that came out during World War II that tried to expand for people in the United States the impression of the distances involved, explains Monmonier. Americans would have been familiar with the standard map of Europe, with north at the top, but if you look east at Europe from the perspective of the Soviet Union, England seems much further away. See the image on the bottom right, from 1950. This is an anti-communist polar project map. The image is from Robert M. Chapin, courtesy of University of Chicago Press. Once the Cold War settled in, though, magazines tried to emphasize how close the United States and the Soviet Union actually were. This map from Time emphasizes the fact that North America is not as far from the Soviet Union as you might think, Monmonier says. The image on the top right is also from 1950. It is a factual and pictorial map of world freedom. The image is from Ernest Dudley Chase, courtesy of University of Chicago Press. Maps were sometimes used as propaganda tools. Mapping world freedom, in this instant, meant painting Russia red. The map was meant to honor the creation of the United Nations. On the top left, we see Lunar Landing Site Map. The image is courtesy of NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and University of Chicago Press. There were 19th century maps of the moon, because moon isn't that far away, says Monmonier. But this one has much more accurate impression of the lunar surface, and it reflects the new age of exploration, in which, like 14th and 15th century explorers, Astronauts would travel to unknown parts and plant a flag. This map documents the landing sites for the USSR's Luna missions from 1956 to 1976 and the American Apollo and Surveyor missions spanning the years from 1966 to 1972. On the bottom left, we see a 1978 image, a detail from Mare Undarum, a lunar map. The image is courtesy of the University of Chicago Press. Even on the moon, the U.S. was quite concerned with communist activity. Making this detailed map required data from satellites circling the moon. That imagery allows you to draw the contour lines, Monmonier says. The same technology was used by the U.S. when overflying the Soviet Union and making maps so that we could understand what was going on there. The image on the top right is from 1998. What we see is a map of Washington, D.C. area using the 1998 Tiger dataset. The image is courtesy of University of Chicago Press. This born digital map came from the Census Bureau's Tiger dataset, which was a key tool for the birth of web-based map making. And finally, the image on the bottom right is from 2015. This photo is from Map Data, copyright 2015 Google. Today's digital maps incorporate features that were hardly dreamed of at the beginning of the 20th century: satellite imagery, interactivity, customization. We use these tools routinely without really even thinking about it. Google Maps can tell you exactly how long it will take to get from Berlin to Timbuktu. By car, it's an 88-hour drive. Or there's a 9-hour flight from Berlin to Mali's capital, Bamako. Add on the 14-hour drive north and you can make the journey in less than 24 hours. All of these maps are incredible examples of images that could have only been made in the 20th century. There are so many recent technologies that have impacted cartography more quickly and more powerfully than most of the innovations before the last 100 years. We now have computers, ubiquitous as they are. We now have GIS, the internet, web mapping, mobile mapping, and big data. The possibilities are absolutely incredible. Computers revolutionized the possibilities leading to GIS. The internet opened up an entirely different world of sharing. Web mapping provided an entirely new medium for how we might present maps, as well as mobile mapping, where we can hold maps in our hand of incredible size and zoom in, zoom out for more or fewer features. Big data is one of the biggest frontiers that we have for cartography, as we have to figure out how in the world are we going to map and show in some visual way the geographic data that's being produced almost constantly by thousands and millions of people. And who knows what upcoming technologies will also have incredible impacts on cartography. Before we get too carried away considering the future possibilities of mapping and cartography based in recent technologies, let's pause to ask the question, what happens to old historic maps? Generally speaking, old historic maps are either lost or they're collected over time. When they're lost, sometimes this is permanent due to, say, catastrophic, unexpected events, such as the destruction of the library in Alexandria, which you may have heard of before. It was a very tragic loss considering it was such a huge connection to the ancient world. Wars are also a reason that artifacts are lost and destroyed, but sometimes artifacts are not destroyed, they're just misplaced, they're lost, they're buried in old papers that are never sorted, and every now and then we find some new artifact, some new map in history that opens our eyes to something that we didn't know about. It's pretty exciting to think that we could literally have map treasures out there. Maybe not treasure maps per se, but the maps themselves are waiting to be found. In terms of collecting, some maps are actually collected by collectors of old maps. We're going to watch a video called Coin Week, Sammy Burke describes the market for map collecting, which will introduce you to a few of the considerations that map collectors make and reasons for map collecting. Maps are also collected by libraries. This is a very common place that they are collected. The Library of Congress, we'll watch a video about that, has the largest collection of maps, but other libraries also have their own collections of maps, sometimes with local themes.